Good morning once again, everybody here in our audience in Glasgow, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our live stream audience all across the world. Welcome back to the Extreme Hangout. I'm delighted this morning to kick off our panel sessions with one hosted kindly by Channel 4 and chaired by the great Krishnan Guru-Murthy. And we have a panel of prominent young activists joining him on the stage this morning to discuss the very serious topic of intersectionality of sustainability with class, with gender, with race, and how those least responsible for the problems are most likely to bear the brunt of the negative effects of climate change. Please put your hands together and welcome our panelists to the stage.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and I'll be moderating the session today. We're very, very keen to hear from you and to hear your questions, because I can ask questions all day, but they may not be the ones that you're most interested in. So seeing as you've come here and done us that honour, then please do tell us what you're really interested to know from our panellists, who are very eminent and very experienced. And when you do send in your questions, I'll get them on an iPad and be able to read them out. Or if you'd like to ask them yourself in person, you can do that as well. Just wait for the microphone to get to you. So let me tell you about our panellists. Right next to me is Joycelyn Longdon, who's originally an astrophysicist, we've just discovered, but is now a climate researcher at Cambridge, and she can tell us a little bit more about that in a moment. Noga Levy Rapoport is sitting next to her and is also an activist, and you may also know, well, I'm sure you will know, Mya-Rose Craig, who's been on Channel 4 News, actually, and is sometimes known as Bird Girl, and is the author of a book, which is out at the moment, and is currently studying at Cambridge herself as well. So let's just begin with where you're all coming from on this, and sort of what climate justice means, because I think, you know, it perhaps means different things to different people. Noga, do you want to begin?
Sure. So yeah, I'm Noga, thank you. Well, I really came to the climate crisis first as an activist and as an organizer. I started off organising the climate strikes in the UK that began sort of start of 2019, so organising these like nationwide monthly climate strikes, and every few months we had, I hope people remember, our global climate strikes culminating in September climate strike 2019, which was to date the largest mobilisation in history around climate change. So that was a really incredible time of these few months of lots and lots of different young people coming together and entering lots of political and organising spaces. For me, I had always been very interested in politics. I kind of grew up with newspapers on the table and very, very political parents who taught me when I was very young about feminism in particular, and that was something that I really took a great interest in. But then climate change, as I started entering those spaces of young people being empowered and learning to organize, was this first issue where I could see all the different sections of our society and of our aspects of socioeconomic injustice coming together. For me, climate change was not just a feminist issue or a racial issue or a migrants' justice issue or a housing issue. It was a healthcare issue, an education issue, and so it tied all of these things together in this really global scope, and I felt that that was somewhere where I could put these passions together and make the mark that I wanted to make and franchise the young people around me in the way I wanted to, open up spaces around us and reclaim our streets and our voices and our own power as young people. And I started doing a lot of that when I was 17, and I'm 19 now, and it's been a very strange 2 years. And I'm very excited to be here at COP26, but it's one of those things where as an activist and as an organizer and as a campaigner, you're constantly looking ahead, but you're always having also to learn from the mistakes of the past and of the mistakes that you've made, of the mistakes that our leaders have made. And so I think, yeah, there's a lot to discuss about how we can keep building that movement, how we can keep pushing forward from the work we've done and the work we can hope to do, the legacy that we want to create.
Thank you. Maya, I mean, what does climate justice mean to you, particularly in the context of this week or this fortnight?
I think conceptually climate justice is very broad, which is partially why it's so important in the first place. If I had to define it personally, I'd probably define it as, I suppose, just looking for equity, pushing for equity within the climate change movement, within climate change negotiations that we have going on today. And I think in terms of COP itself, you can see in many ways it being the absolute antithesis of this concept of climate justice, the way that it's not allowing indigenous voices to be heard, the way that these Western nations are dominating negotiations despite climate change being an issue created by the West, impacting countries in the global south the most. You know, you've got all of these different things going on that are the opposite of what especially the younger generations are pushing for. Because recently I was asked to describe the youth movement in one word, and the word that I came up with was just intersectional. I think what young people are pushing for is intersectionality within our movements and in terms of the future. And I think that global climate justice is an absolutely key part of that in terms of climate change, because it is acknowledging that this isn't just an environmental issue, this is a race issue, it's a class issue, it's a post-colonial issue, and that we can't truly solve this issue in a sustainable way unless we acknowledge all of that and, I suppose, move on with that in mind.
How does the intersectionality of this then play in the context of these negotiations and COP26 on something like China, which is both one of the most affected nations in terms of climate change and injustice, but is also being attacked for walking away from these negotiations and is not here. I mean, I spoke to somebody quite close to the negotiations this morning who said China is literally absent at the moment.
And I think the fact that that's been allowed to happen within the negotiations is a sign of failure of the negotiations in the first place, because China is such a key player in terms of climate change. But I do think in general, the way that we talk about China in terms of climate change is very strange and quite often quite oxymoronic, I suppose, in terms of it's this one thing of, I suppose, again, this post-colonial thing of, you know, this distant Eastern nation, that they're the source of all the climate change, they're the ones pumping tons and tons of carbon out into the atmosphere, they're the ones who don't care if their, I don't know, population's dying because of air pollution. But simultaneously, this is the country that is manufacturing the majority of the world's goods, and so this has become an issue of the mainly the West, but lots of countries essentially exporting their carbon pollution to another country. And I think it's that aspect that's not explored enough. And you see it similarly with countries like India as well, which I suppose is the intersectionality of it. It's acknowledging that there are different aspects. But I think the fact that China has felt that they can and that they should walk away from these negotiations is, in my opinion, a sign of wider failure, to be honest.
Joycelyn, explain how your work plays into climate justice.
So I guess my work is split in half, but all rooted in education. So currently my PhD work is rooted in environmental justice by really challenging the ways that we do conservation work. My work is all about forest conservation and technology, but centering Indigenous knowledge and having Indigenous-led solutions to forest conservation. And it's really challenging this notion of, again, the West and following in colonial footsteps, exporting solutions, not including at all people on the ground who live there, who are affected there, who are most affected there, and really perpetuating land grabs, perpetuating colonial behaviours in general. So that's what my research is rooted in. It's rooted in using the tools that we have and looking at co-creation, co-design, and really coming together to make equity-centred solutions. And then with Climate in Colour...
What does that mean? Sorry. I mean, there's a lot of jargon in this, and some people will not understand it all. So what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, having equity at the centre of solutions, kind of, as I said, is including all of the key players in the solutions that we're creating. It's not me as a Global North researcher picking a random forest and saying, I'm going to research that, and then I'm going to go and talk to policymakers and tell them what to do with that patch of forest, without consulting the people on the ground who live there, who interact with the forest, who have knowledge as experts, not technical experts, but experts of lived experience, experts of their own knowledge, experts of their own science, to lead that research in collaboration. So whether that's in forest conservation, or whether that's in community energy, or whether that's in, you know, whatever the solution is, it's making sure that all the people who are going to be affected and all the people who should be at the table, whether they're a technical expert, whether they're a policymaker, or whether they're on the ground, need to be at the table to create that solution so that it is actually sustainable in a holistic way, not just sustainable in terms of carbon, because we focus too much on carbon, sustainable in all senses of the word sustainable.
Noga, we should talk about climate justice and intersectionality, I suppose, in two ways. You know, one in terms of actual effects of climate change, but the other also in terms of the environmental movements. What should we talk about first?
Well, I think...
I'd have thought the real effects are the things that we should probably hit first, but...
Well, I mean, I would see them both as very much tied together. The reasons why we have to approach solving climate change with an intersectional outlook, and the reasons why the environmental movement has traditionally been so white, so middle class, so Western, so focused really in lots of, or we see it as focused in the global north, are the exact same colonial and imperial reasons why climate change was brought about in the first place. So we can't have an intersectional approach to environmentalism. We can't have an equity and justice-based solution. We can't fundamentally restructure our society to deal with climate change without restructuring our movement. So those things really come together.
Hasn't the movement actually completely changed? I mean, in my adult lifetime, environmentalism has gone from basically middle-aged white men who you know, were listened to by some people, to basically you lot.
I think it's...
I was going to say that I think in lots of ways the movement hasn't changed. Well, because, I mean, when you think about where the environmental movement came from, it started really about 40 years ago, and it started in lots and lots of places in the global south. And that kind of active erasure and neglect and sometimes suppression on behalf of government leaders and on corporations. I mean, think about like Shell and the Ogoni 9. These are examples where activist suppression has gone to the extent that we do think of the environmental movement as solely white and middle class and Western. But I think the specific change that has come from young people like us. It's come from kind of this massive injection of young people into the environmental movement, because we basically just decided that we were sick of not being included. And that has led to this very radical shift of who can speak, who's being listened to. And it's also led to us kind of standing here and going, well, who isn't being listened to? Who is being silenced?
Maya, you were going to come in there, weren't you?
Yeah, I was going to say on top of that, on the flip side of it, I think to say that this movement's always been middle-class white men is slightly disingenuous as well. Because if we go back even further to maybe the 60s or the 70s, the hippie movement.
I said my lifetime.
Yes, but I think like it's really important to acknowledge that women have always been centre to the environmental movement, and women have always been the ones pushing it forward. But despite that, you know, if you go to the very top levels of environmentalism, whether that's campaigning or media or various other things, it's men. And there somehow within activism spaces of all things, there has been this glass ceiling that's formed, which is absolutely ridiculous. And I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge that women are at the core of this movement, both in the global north and the global south, and always have been.
So what's your own experience here?
A fun two sides of the same coin, I suppose, in that I've been doing this since I was 11. I'm 19 now, and it's been like really core to my life experiences in general. I can't really imagine who I would be if I hadn't turned to activism and campaigning. But at the same time, the volumes of like sexism that that was, I suppose, expressed to me from when I started at a really young age was like especially retrospectively very shocking. I think I was less shocked at the time as a child than I am now looking back thinking who was saying that.
In what way? I mean, just give us an example.
I mean, there were all the things that were slightly unacknowledged, the fact that my male peers never got half as much aggression or vitriol as I did online and things like that. But also the more explicit comments that were always fun, you know, telling me literally that little girls should sit down and stop talking about politics and things like that, despite the fact that I was someone who at the time was driving various movements forward. And I think it's this wider thing over and over again, without like leaving the environmental conversation too much, of like undermining the work, both literally and the emotional labor that women give to this movement that again powers it forwards, and it would crumble without that. Like even when I was writing my book last year, I wanted it to be 50-50 gender-wise. It was a struggle to find enough men for there to be 15 boys in my book.
And have you found that you are constantly pigeonholed? You know, as one thing or another in terms of your specialism. You know, you've had profile in different ways. You know, from different bits of activism you've done, particularly in terms of access to the countryside for ethnic minorities and things like that. So, do you find that if you talk about that, then that's all people want to talk to you about?
I mean, yeah, to an extent. But I think something that's been really important to me has been to avoid being pigeonholed. I think especially like these days when activism has to be consumable in some shape or form, it's very easy for people to say that they want you to have a niche and that's the thing that you talk about. But for me personally, I got into activism because I care. Like that's what this boils down to. I care about the planet, I care about our future, and that expresses itself in loads of different forms. And there isn't one single issue that is the thing that I want to campaign about for the next 8 years as I have been for the last 8, you know? And I think, you know, there's lots of things I care about. That's what it boils down to.
Joycelyn, I mean, Noga mentioned, you know, or in fact you mentioned as well, actually, you know, how solutions from the global north can't simply be imported to the global south. Just flesh that out a little bit in terms of this whole question.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the rhetoric that stands around the global south, and with that I'm including marginalised communities, because there's always been this sort of paternalism, which is like the global north feeling like they are looking after the global south. And I think that actually one of my bugbears of this conference has been this rhetoric, and actually, you know, for a long time around it, that, you know, if we're talking about the £100 billion that the developed countries need to provide for global south countries for mitigation and adaptation, that has been constantly spewed as a sort of charity. It's a giving, but actually it's a debt that's owed. It's a very real debt that's owed. It's not charity. And if we think about, for example, Africa, because a lot of my work is focused there, they currently front 80 to 90% of the finance for adaptation and mitigation. So they are actually leading their own climate action, and they're asking for the debt to be paid. So I think that when we're thinking about solutions, we always have this idea that the global south are begging for the global north's help and need our support, which, of course, if we're talking about collaboration, that's an equal collaborative effort. But it's not this situation where the global south are just waiting with their arms open for our support. They're actually waiting with their arms open for our action, which we're not giving them. And they are suffering and at the forefront of all of the issues that we have mainly created. And so I think it's really about language here and really about the perspective that is given to capacity within the global south. And it actually just eradicates the strength, power, intelligence, tenacity of global south activists, researchers, business owners who are really making a change, but they don't have a voice to share that with the world. So yeah.
And we're about to see that again now, aren't we? Because the whole 100 billion question is very much a live issue over the next few days. And we've seen, well, the Nigerians the other day saying, well, this is double standards. How do you change the narrative on that then, from charity to debt?
I think changing the narrative is really about radical honesty. It's about governments and people in the global north really assessing who is to blame and coming out with it and actually giving up space for people in the global south to speak, to tell about their ideas, to tell about their needs. And this should be the space to do it. This should be the space for global south campaigners, global south governments to be able to show what it is that they need and what it is that they're doing currently on the ground, and to be on a global stage to show off the solutions that they currently have and to highlight the gaps that they need support in. So I think it's really about narrative, because we constantly see, you know, politicians going on the press talking about the developing world in a very specific way, and they're actually not given a voice to talk about it from their perspective. And so that continues to just perpetuate this idea that they're charity cases. So really stepping back and giving them space to speak is, I think, really important in changing that narrative.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost promoted as this like kindness, whereas it's much less a kindness than it is paying the fair share of debt and reparations that these colonial and imperial countries owe. This isn't like a kindness, it's an action that needs to be done out of necessity, not just out of like a moral duty, but a duty to literally save people's lives. This is, when we frame this as a kindness, we forget that people's lives are at stake. People lose their homes and their jobs, and that not just the way they live, but the opportunity to exist with respect and decency is robbed when rich nations in the West refuse to act on climate change. This COP26 is about so much more than just like negotiating a deal here and platforming like a UK politician there. It's about genuinely saving people's lives from the exploitation and extractivist culture and system that we live in.
So how does your movement engage with the need for many developing world countries to keep doing polluting things at the moment? You know, because a lot of the rhetoric in your movement is about stop it now. It's got to stop now. For a lot of these countries, you know, well, perhaps for all countries, it's not possible to stop it now, is it? So what does that really mean when you say stop it now?
Well, yeah, I'm sure everyone else will have more to add to this as well, but I think the first thing we also have to consider is that lots of these developing countries have nowhere near the scale of emissions that we produce. There are sustainable ways to exist as a wider economy. You know, there are sustainable ways to function without constant greenwashed extractivism. And renewable energy obviously does not come at the cost of developing our economy. It doesn't come at the cost of innovation or technology. But again, it kind of comes back to the blame and responsibility and saying, well, the people who need to stop aren't countries where so much of the population is suffering and living in poverty and afraid of climate disaster. Those aren't the countries that are contributing emissions. I mean, we spoke about China earlier and how, I mean, you mentioned how it's often used as this like scapegoat of like, well, we don't have to look at ourselves, we just need to look at China and they need to fix up. And of course, there are so many people in China that are worried and rightfully so about climate disaster that will hit and continues to hit, about dangerous levels of pollution. But again, China is a key player. The UK is a key player, the US is a key player. Loads and loads of these countries are responsible for these emissions. When we say stop it now, we're not talking about areas that are most affected by climate change. Obviously, horrifically, ironically, we're talking about areas that are yet to see. Whilst we've seen flooding and we've seen heat waves in the UK, we've like had a taste of what's to come and what other countries are experiencing. It's difficult, obviously, for UK politicians to hear, and maybe that's why they're refusing to act, but we're the problem. And when it's why so much of our pressure has been focused on our leaders, not on the leaders of other countries, but because we're right here in this country, we have a civic and moral duty and a responsibility to pressure our leaders to act, to lobby corporations and lobby our MPs and fight for change right from our communities in the grassroots right to the international stage at COP26. Because we are responsible for such a high and horrific level of emissions. And we are responsible for people's lives. We are responsible for ending the exploitation of our planet, our people, and our resources.
So how do we change what the solutions look like? You know, if we don't like the way that the solution is being framed at the moment by international governments, how do you want to change it, Maya?
To go back to the last question, like I would agree that it's not a stop it now, it's just a please act now, like do something rather than do nothing. And so I suppose for me, like as a youth activist in particular, one of the most frustrating things is the awareness that this is an issue that if not stopped completely could have been on the road to being solved before I was ever even born. And so I think the thing with climate change in general is there are so many solutions, there are so many different options to go about starting to solve it, and just none of them are being properly utilised. And I think partially, like this is something I talk about it sometimes. I think this is really important, that environmental issues have been politicised, and I think that that is something that is causing a massive block in terms of action. It's become this thing where if you're on the left, you care about the environment, you want to take environmental action. If you're on the right, you're not supposed to care about the environment. You don't want to help solve climate change or whatever.
Do you think that's still the case?
I do think that's true to an extent, and I think you can see that in projects like HS2, where it's this narrative of we don't want to let the environmentalists win, because I suppose it's this thing of wanting to say we care about the people, we care about money more than we care about nature. That's how it's framed, you know, it's these tree huggers over here, and they're trying to, you know, make us put loads of money into trees and things like that. We're putting money into economic development because we care about the people. That's how it's framed. And I don't think historically it would have been like that. I think historically the right would have been looking for right-wing ways to solve the climate crisis, and the left would have been looking for left-wing ways to solve the climate crisis. And I think that that is one of the key things that we have to push back against. And I think that that's been one of the main blocks in terms of COP. And I think in general, the way that environmental issues have been politicised is a massive issue in and of itself. And so I guess in terms of the solutions going forward, we could go for an economic solution. We could go for a just transition, to a green economy, something like that. Or if you're on the left, you could go for something more radical. You can start breaking down, I don't know, consumer culture or even capitalism, you know, whatever. It doesn't really matter.
And how do you keep the problem that you identified earlier of intersectionality in how you're addressing things like biodiversity?
I mean, in terms of biodiversity in particular, I think biodiversity and climate change are two sides of the same coin in terms of environmental issues. And I think intersectionality actually helps you acknowledge that. I think historically, the way that we've talked about climate change has always been very distant and very non-tangible, but also the way that we talk about it has always been sort of within a vacuum, not really acknowledging the wider knock-on effects that it's going to have on this planet. And I suppose in terms of intersectionality, you're acknowledging that it isn't, as some people call it, you know, great equalizer, but this is an issue that's only going to be highlighting more and more the issues, the divides that already exist within society. People who are wealthy are going to be the last to be affected. People who are poorer or struggling, or you know, women or people of colour are going to be the first to suffer because of climate change. And so I suppose what I'm saying is intersectionality has always been there within climate change. What we're doing now is acknowledging that these links exist and that we have to do something about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I suppose it's the question of what specifically we do about it, Joycelyn. I mean, you know, can you break it down a little?
Mm-hmm. I think the really important thing to think about is that there's not just one future. There are many futures, many possible futures that we could live in that can all coexist at the same time. So it's not about one solution. It's about having as many solutions as possible to get us where we need to be, but in an equitable way. So if we're thinking about economy, for example, moving to an economy where consumption is decreased and where the focus is on prolonging our use of items, making sure that our items have a supply chain that is equitable, that is not destroying our planet, and ensuring that anyone who is going to be out of pocket because of, you know, shutting down coal plants or shutting down oil refineries have somewhere to go after that and can continue to prosper. If we're talking about biodiversity, that's about ensuring that everyone, humans and nature, are considered together as one, not just as a separate sort of silo, and ensuring that biodiversity, again, comes with economic empowerment and also comes with social cohesion. So I think it's the fact that we need to use everything that we've got, and actually we already have pretty much all of the solutions. They could have been enacted years ago, decades ago. So I think actually everyone really does know what the solutions are out there, and there are tons of people, researchers, activists, working on it all the time and ensuring that we get to a position where these solutions are actually really easy to enact. It's actually, I think, more about political will on one hand, and also consumers will, because I think a lot of people, especially in the UK, are very, very comfortable, don't want to change their life a little bit, or don't want to speak out and use their voice. They want to continue living their life the way that they want to. And I think if we really want to be honest with ourselves, we as a community in the UK or in other Western countries in the US can make a lot of changes and still be quite comfortable. That would make a lot of difference. So I think it's both sides, political will and also consumers' will, to actually just do the things that we all know that we're supposed to do. The government know what we're supposed to do. We know what we're supposed to do. And making sure that equity is at the centre of all of those things.
So, well, in terms of sort of consumer behaviour, then, what do you make of the kind of conversation that we've had from the government about things like micro decisions? Now, you know, because when that came out, you know, everyone snorted and said, this is, you know, how on earth can we still be in this place where, you know, people are talking about these little sort of micro decisions as if they're the things that are going to solve the problem. But they do have a role in this as well, don't they? From what you're saying.
Prioritising the roles of certain solutions, right? So if you're a consumer, there are some really big decisions that you can make. For example, I don't have a car. I actively decided to not have a car. Obviously, that's not the decision everyone's going to make. Some people need a car. But it's just about, there are really obvious things that you can change about your life to make a positive impact. I think the thing that people miss out, though, is that consumer power isn't just about the things you buy. It's about how you engage with the government, how you engage with corporations, and how you make your voice heard. So micro actions, yes, they have a place, but where on the priority list is that? And really, when you get to micro solutions, it becomes an issue of the chicken or the egg, because are the systems in place by the government to allow you to actually make an action that is impactful? For example, recycling. I recycle everything and I compost everything with the knowledge that only 5 to 7% of that is actually getting recycled. I still do it because it's the right thing to do, but for other people, that action is they're going to think, well, what's the point? Why should I do that? So it's kind of chicken or the egg. The government have to create an environment where people can make the right decisions in order for us to move to a better place.
And in terms of sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say as well, I think this conversation around individual action has always been used as a slightly diversionary tactic within the climate change movement as well. And I think it's really important to highlight that the concept of a carbon footprint in the first place came from a think tank sponsored by fossil fuel companies. It's always been used as a tactic to distract us from what is the main issue, which is companies and corporations, 100 of which are causing over 70% of carbon emissions on this planet. And I think I just wanted to acknowledge that.
No. Well, that's exactly what I'm getting at. So do you want to kill that whole conversation around the importance of running your hot water for a little less during the day?
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. I mean, I don't think in the scheme of things it is particularly important, but I think more importantly, a lot of people feel too guilty, like they're not good enough to engage with environmental action and with the wider climate change movement because they maybe do have a car or they do eat meat sometimes or whatever. And so I think that is probably the biggest issue with this conversation because it is the right thing to do. You're right, we're trying as individual people to be better and to be better for the planet. But a lot of people aren't really in the position, whether mentally or financially, to do that. And so I think turning our eye to the much bigger issue, which is corporate greed, which is government inaction, is going to be far more important. And I do think at the end of the day, government action hopefully will have that trickle down. Actually, I won't use the phrase trickle down, but will hopefully have an impact on people's individual actions as well, whether that is facilitating people to recycle more or putting in more bike lanes so more people can cycle to work, you know, all that kind of stuff.
And just to ask you the same question I was talking to you, to relate it to the earlier conversation we were having about intersectionality and racial justice and gender as well, what specifically do you think we can do beyond just saying, well, we should think about that, in terms of leadership roles, education, all those sorts of things, to solve those issues as well?
So in terms of intersectionality?
Yeah.
I think it...
Because it's like you have the intersectionality conversation, then you have the climate conversation. And
no, I don't think so.
You kind of need to sort of bring them all together, don't
exactly.
you? Yes.
And I think that's really what I'm trying to do, both with my research and with my platform, is to say these issues, if we're talking about, I don't know, biodiversity, or if we're talking about energy production, there is so it's intersectional at the heart. It's not just talking about the facts and stats, and it's not just talking about the sociology. It's about bringing them all together. And so I think, especially with education, I've been doing lots of work with the Primary Science Teachers Coalition and lots of schools coalitions, and they're really starting to bring this into the curriculum, but also just generally, like, adults also need that education as well to understand how your actions or how the government's actions also intersect with other forms of oppression. And so it's not about having this one climate conversation and this, here are the racial justice people and here are the, women's justice people. It's actually all the same issue. And I think the quicker that people get used to that and the quicker that people get used to speaking about all these issues at once, the more progress that we're going to make. Because I think, these silos are not helpful at all. And when governments are talking about issues, they like to reduce them, really like to reduce it to this, sort of ball of stats and facts. But actually, I think that if in government we just had more honesty, if in discussions we had a lot more honesty about, okay, these are messy conversations. These are difficult conversations. They don't have to have a one strap line to give out to the world. They are messy. They are, confusing. There is going to be friction. That's part of the process. We don't need to be afraid of having tension and having friction as long as the whole process is equitable.
And I think it kind of brings sort of what you were saying about individualism and this idea of separate conversations, whereas climate change is a systemic issue. It comes from the extractivist and honestly the capitalist systems that we live in. Those economic systems enable, facilitate, encourage, and in some cases even enforce a level of exploitation of our planet and a consumption of our nature and our resources that is obviously beyond what we have the capacity for as a planet. And so the solution to that has to be systemic. In that systemic solution, it's not just about making space for an intersectional conversation or making space to allow for marginalized communities to have a better future and a better present, but it's about recognizing that where climate change comes from is right at this intersection, this heart of all these separate injustices that have built up over the years to mean that now, if we want to make that just transition to a totally renewable society, we have to combat in the same breath low wages and unemployment. We have to combat poverty, lack of education. We have to combat a healthcare crisis, a housing crisis, the problem of climate refugees, which will happen regardless of, even if we stopped using all fossil fuels now, there are enough climate disasters locked in that we need to make space for the people who will need to move around the world. This comes through that restructuring. And we've spoken a bit, we've mentioned kind of the Green New Deal, and in some cases there's also been talk of the Red Deal, which is carrying kind of much more anti-imperialism at its heart. But all these ideas and these solutions, which again do exist, are about resolving this systemically, which will enable us to make individual changes. It's about expanding our public infrastructure, our transport, to make it cheap and or free in the most accessible way. Lots of people use a car right now because they need one, because they have no trains or buses that are cheap near them. If you live in an incredibly rural area, and you need to get to COP26, how are you going to do that without the public infrastructure that government provides? How are you going to change your consumption and your food choices without that being massively, massively lowered in terms of price and accessibility? That is the government's responsibility. And
do you think there is a generational divide and a generational difference in terms of how people think of tackling injustice? Because a lot of the words you've just been using, frankly, scare a lot of older people. And by older people, I guess I'm talking about anyone over 40. When you talk about capitalism being the problem, when you talk about imperialism, there are loads of people out there who find that really alarming language. They go, oh, they're anti-capitalists. They want to take everything away from me. Do you think there is a real difference in your generation in how people think about that?
I think it's really interesting because lots of the people that I've worked with over the last 2 years have been much, much older and have been huge inspirations to me, but have also really supported lots of young people in their organising. And I think it's because These are generations of experienced activists and organisers who have been trying to campaign against climate change for so long. And again, every generation comes to the conclusion that our economic systems are the problem. I think that it's really important for the climate change movement to be explicitly anti-capitalist, explicitly anti-imperialist, because without that explicit nature, we don't have the honesty that you really mentioned that is so important.
Do you all agree on that?
Yeah, and I think as well as a young person, like I don't have as positive a relationship with capitalism as someone in an older generation would. One of my first memories as a child is the Wall Street crash and the banks collapsing and everything like that. And my whole of my teenage years has been watching greed, whether that's corporate or, general consumerism, tear this planet apart. And so I think for younger generations as well, it's maybe easier to narrow in on that because there's
all we've known is crisis.
Yeah, all we've known is crisis. That's a good way to phrase
I
it.
would caution, though, not to have this sort of like battle of the generations, right? Because I
Yeah.
don't think it's really useful for the climate movement. Because actually, there are lots of people who are my age who would rather just go and work for Goldman Sachs and make a huge ton of money and prepare for their future. And also, this isn't taken into consideration. I'm not saying whether this is good or bad, but a lot of people who are first or second generation immigrants have a duty to their family for economic prosperity, to support their family from the investments that those families have made, the tearing of their families that have happened. I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that
It's a fact.
it's a fact, and that equally there are lots of older people who have actually, given away a lot of their freedoms that they could have had in order to stand up, and knowing that they've lived most of their life. There's so many people older people in movements who actually make themselves a lot more vulnerable because they're sort of being altruistic in that way. So I think of course for the
So
most.
do you think you can be a capitalist and a pro-capitalist and tackle climate injustice?
To the root of it, no, because the reason we're here is because of capitalism. Now, the story of what the reality we're currently living in right now, that's a different story. And can we imagine something outside of capitalism? Can we move to something outside of capitalism that still provides prosperity for people, security for people, health for people? Let's move in that direction. Let's put our minds together to create that. But as a core philosophy, you can't, not that compatible.
Okay.
It might be a philosophical and ideological issue, but it's still a necessity of survival. Like
Right now,
just because we recognise that capitalism and the solutions to climate change can't go together, doesn't mean that we don't have to exist within capitalist spaces at this very moment. We have to work and get paid for the jobs we do, and we have to. We're all in some form of education, whether it's as students or researchers. And we see how education is constantly marketized. We still have to exist in those spaces because we have to exist and we have to survive. And actually, a lot of what we're doing around saying, well, capitalism and climate change can't go together is saying, I don't want to exist in a space where I feel like burning myself out and working all the time is like a precondition of my own survival. I want to exist in a space where prosperity is and my health and my well-being comes to me naturally, comes to me as a right. And that's what a solution to climate change can be.
But I think, for me, to boil it down very simply, I'm not saying let's start dismantling society in the next 6 months so we can combat climate change, but it's thinking about very long-term solutions once we've dealt with the very immediate urgency of the next 5 years or so, and figuring out what those long-term solutions are going to be to prevent a crisis like this from happening again, when we do manage to deal with climate change.
Okay, let's just, because I want to get on to the audience questions in a moment, but I just want briefly to go around you all in terms of engaging with COP26 solutions, what you want to come out of this. Maya, yesterday you were at a session with Greta, in which she said, for her, success at COP26 would be for everyone to realise what a failure COP26 is. Is that how you feel? That you want to get, what you want to come out of this? Or is there something else?
I think, to an extent, yes. In that I think so far COP26 has been a failure. I think I called it farcical yesterday, and I stand by that. I think it's I've been talking to activists who have been at historical COPs, and they said it's worse than previous ones, despite the issue obviously becoming more urgent with every passing year. And so I suppose with the COP that currently exists, I think it would be really important for people to acknowledge at the end that this is not the action that we need to see from our leaders. You know, stunts like the thing at the Trevi Fountain should be seen as absolutely shocking by people who are observing them from the outside. But that's not what I want from COP. What I want from COP is, you know, again, action, keep on saying it, but I would quite like, you know, active decisions to be made by our leaders, and I'd quite like them to come together and say, actually, yes, this is a really important issue, we're going to start doing something about it. But with the way that it's going at the moment, I don't feel like we're going to get that, despite it being a very basic want.
Yeah, well, there's still a week to go, but I mean...
Yeah, I mean, you know, you mentioned earlier about this idea of like activist influencers being told you have to have a niche and stuff like that. And I think I would say that, like, change is not a brand. Change is not just 2 weeks at COP26, however much we'd like it to be. I would love it if a miracle happened and at the end of next week we had a set of deals that were already being acted on, commitments that we knew were going to take place, and good faith action, mitigation, adaptation from leaders on climate change. But change doesn't start like that. It starts with us in our communities. It starts with collaborative grassroots actions. It starts with building coalitions with solidarity, equity, and justice baked right into the heart of those coalitions. It starts with education, whether that's from working with primary school teachers to supporting the new climate emergency education bill, you know, it's being tabled now. It starts with us coming together and saying we can actually leave a much greater legacy outside of COP26 than we have to here. We can say this is not an individual problem. It's a problem that will and must be solved systemically. We will build that pressure. We will keep fighting to build that pressure. We will keep building that movement, no matter what it takes, because we don't have the time to do anything else.
Jocelyn.
I think the main thing to note is that climate action doesn't start or end with COP, and that, you know, what we really need is for in the year to come actual action to happen. If I want a specific action to come out, I do want that £100 billion for global south countries, and not just the commitment to that money, but actually a plan to get access to that money and for that money to actually be spread to the people who need it on the ground. That's my main specific action I want out of COP.
I mean, we will probably get that, but we'll probably get it with a delayed start date.
Yeah. But I think the most important thing is actually how it works on the ground, because that's a big issue about how the finance actually gets through to making the impact that it needs to. Okay. But again, climate action doesn't start or end with COP. There's a lot more to do.
Now, I'm going to go through some of these questions that have come in on the app. We probably don't have time to go around all of you, so why don't you just kind of shout out your answers, and then we'll kind of get through as many as we can. This is from Roxanne. How can we harness and build momentum from COP and translate this across the UK? Can the climate justice movement complement the levelling up agenda?
I think, firstly, one of the most exciting things about COP is just how much we've been able to translate it to digital spaces. I think that's one of the greatest assets and tools that we can use. I think social media and our digital networks provide us with this kind of endless archive of inspiration, collaboration, and networks that we can reach out to people with and connect people with. That is something that organisers on the ground at COP from different aspects of the climate movement have been able to do really, really well. I mean, I know that this is being live streamed. I know we'll probably have a great digital audience. That's something that we can keep building on. We can keep making those connections, forming those groups and those communities. I'm hopeful that whatever way COP goes, whether it's a miserable failure or whether it's a huge success, either of those things will be able to use to harness the emotions and the fallout from that. If it's a miserable failure, then I want people to be angry, and I think we can make people angry. I want people to break free of the paralysis that we've kind of been so forced into, especially from kind of all this guilt tripping about individual action. And I want us to be able to say, look, if you're angry and if you want action, use that as an asset, keep driving yourself forward. So whatever happens now, I think we'll be able to use that.
We've got lots of people from all over the world asking questions. Louis from France, is there a solution in which we can protect the climate and reduce extreme poverty?
I mean, again, I think they're linked together. Like I keep on saying that about lots of things, but I think most things are linked together in some shape or form, and I think climate change is absolutely part of that. I mean, I'm trying to think about the best way to do that. I think in general, what we're trying to do is break down inequality, and we're trying to push back against various issues that are within that, I suppose, and poverty is absolutely part of that. I think that something that's hopefully going to come out of this is, at some point, is more taxation, especially of very, very wealthy 1% people, such as the infamous Jeff Bezos, but, you know, various billionaires and things like that. What we're looking for is wealth redistribution, because I think one of the things that I've heard over and over again from leaders is that they don't have the money needed to fight climate change, and I think there are so many what are essentially very big pots of money sat around waiting to be extracted.
Although we've kind of heard the opposite this week, haven't we? We've heard about trillions and trillions of private finance. Now, the problem is none of that's really going into poverty alleviation.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I suppose it depends as well, because I think in terms of poverty in the global south, I think if we start going towards reparations, we're talking about this £100 billion and things like that. I think it absolutely ties together. In Bangladesh, where my family's from, the like 4 or 5 million climate change refugees that have come to the capital city, most of them are poor farmers who, you know, have nothing left to turn to. This is what we're talking about climate change impacting the poorest people first. And so I suppose when you start to put the billions or trillions or whatever it is into climate change mitigation, especially in the global south, what that should be doing in theory is helping people who are dealing the most with destitution and poverty.
Nuha from Pakistan asks, how can I initiate conversations in my community about climate action effectively? I have been shut down many times because I'm a woman.
Yeah, I mean, that is reality in so many spaces, and it's really sad because women are at the forefront of this issue, especially in global south countries. I think the one thing I would say is that we don't have to communicate climate justice in the same way to everybody. The way that I communicate might be different when I'm speaking to an academic, might be different when I'm speaking to my mum, might be different when I'm speaking to my younger sister. We don't have to have these like straight lines where we, you know, come at the issue in one certain way to everybody. And I think it's really tapping in culturally. For example, my family are from Ghana, and I put a post up ages ago talking about bucket baths and about how, and I think lots of Bangladeshi families do this as well, it saves
You
water.
might have to explain.
I will explain.
Especially to the white people what a bucket bath is.
A bucket bath basically is you fill up a bucket with water and you wash yourself with it, and you pour the bucket over yourself to wash yourself. And this is culturally, it's a way that we bathe, and that we grow up bathing, and it saves a lot more water. That's not the reason why people do it. It's cultural, but you know, it's connecting with your community. Like, what are the things that you're already doing, your community already does, that is sustainable, and tapping into that. It doesn't always have to be the stats, facts, and all of the glossy, witty lines. It's really tapping into how can I use this as a way to connect with my family or my culture.
Is there anyone in the room who'd like to ask a question before I carry on? Yes, there's a microphone in the room. Yeah.
We've spoken quite a lot about intersectionality, but haven't necessarily touched on, I think, the class barrier here in the UK as well. I think, like, a lot of families will struggle to feed their family and heat their homes this winter. And as someone that's from Glasgow and lives and works here, I think I've seen and felt that people feel that COP is something that's been done to them, and it's not really touching on their everyday lives. I think I'd be interested to hear from the panel how we can kind of tackle that class barrier and people not see it as a middle class choice to buy organic food or Vega trainers, or, you know, I think it can feel very, very far away from just ordinary people, and certainly feels far away from ordinary Glaswegians.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think you're right, that is something that doesn't get acknowledged enough within the UK environmental movement. In terms of Glasgow in general, I think that's a failure of COP to have engaged with the people in the city when that is the primary group of people that this conference should have been engaging with. But I think in general, when talking to people about climate change and things like that, I bring it closer to home. Because I think for a lot of people, when you're struggling day to day to get food on the table, things like that, thinking about an issue that's going to affect you in 5-10 years' time, that feels very distant and it does not feel like a priority. But making climate change much more real. So for example, I live in the southwest, so for the people who live near me locally, I talk a lot about flooding because there has been so much flooding. There have been so many communities that have been swept away. And talking to someone and saying, actually, your house has been built on a floodplain. You are very likely to also get swept away in the next few years, and that's something that you need to think about. I think that that engages people with an issue because it suddenly isn't, you know, this middle class pastime where you're trying to decide whether you should buy corn or some other meat, you know, whatever. It's like, it's your livelihoods, it's your lives, it's your children, it's your jobs. And I think that that in general has been a failure around climate change communication in the UK because it absolutely is a class issue, and that doesn't get acknowledged enough.
I think the thing I'd also add as well is that, you know, you were talking about these decisions that people want to make, but actually, if you're working class, and I grew up on a council estate, you have smallest footprint of anyone in the country. So it's really not about that. And it really is about, and this is how I came into the climate justice movement. I came from racial justice. And so it's kind of similar with class justice, is actually talking about class injustices. It doesn't actually have to be climate related, because actually most of the injustices that people who are working class will face, they are going to be at the forefront of those climate injustices at the same time. They're one and the same. So if you're thinking about communities in London, I grew up in London, who are more diverse, they're more exposed to air pollution. Now, you can come at that from the air pollution perspective, or you can just come at that from the class perspective. It's really about, as I said before, molding the conversation to who you're talking about. Like, I couldn't care less whether they buy all their food from Lidl in plastic wrapping. Like, that's not the issue for a working class family. And it's really thinking about their health and their prosperity and making sure that they're safe first, rather than all of this like guilt tripping about individual action.
Thanks. Do you want to add anything on this, Noga?
No, I think
fine. Okay.
it was all covered.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Anyone else in the room before? Yeah, go on.
I want to ask, before tackling environment, don't you think we should tackle poverty? Or cause if you look at South Asian countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Africa, those people, like, before even tackling environment, they would want to live the same quality life as we live here in Europe. So they, if you go to them, like by India, for example, they pollute so much, but if you go to them, tell them, yeah, you need to look after the environment, they'll be like, no, we need to like live better before. We need to live the same quality life as in Europe. So how would you approach to those kind of people? Like, they wouldn't approach environment same way as here.
I think that is important. It's not actually about the individual people. It's about the life that they are given the opportunity to live by their governments. So governments really need to work on creating policy that means that people can make better decisions, and that those decisions can be made either voluntarily, but involuntarily too, but that also brings around economic prosperity. I don't think it's one or the other. It's really making sure that there is space. Again, I'll talk from an African context. Say you're a cocoa farmer, that there's space for you to sustainably produce cocoa and sustainably farm cocoa, and get a good price for your cocoa so that you can live a better life and send your children to school and all of the things that come with economic prosperity. So I really think it's baking in wealth redistribution and also prosperity within actions that can, without anyone actually having to make a decision or change their lives so much in that specific situation of poverty, that they can get economic prosperity at the same time.
It does involve some change there, doesn't it? I mean, you know, there are millions of people in India for whom, or Bangladesh or Pakistan, I would imagine, but I know, I've talked to lots of people in India about it, you know, whose ambition is to be able to afford a car. You know, and they've grown up for years, you know, with their father and their mother desperately wanting to have a car and not being able to afford it, and having a moped and that being their means of transport. And now they work, you know, they might work in a call centre and a car is within reach. And suddenly we're telling them, well, you can't do that.
Well, I guess that's where it goes back to what's the infrastructure for government, right? Is there the possibility for you to buy a car that is electric? Is there the infrastructure for that to happen? So, you know, it's about balancing the attainment of economic prosperity and the feeling of economic achievement with a system where that doesn't come at the expense of the environment.
Okay. You know what? We are almost out of time. So thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to do any more questions in the room. But that's been a really great conversation. We've galloped through a lot there and touched on a lot of issues. So thank you very much indeed, everybody in the room, for engaging with that. All of you at home or wherever you are have been watching and engaging with it as well on the internet. And to you three, good luck. Have a good week. Hope it goes well.
Thanks so much.